people. But why were you so hopeful?
So this was one of those cases where we came up with the name before we started filming. We just thought that it would be great that there'd be a film that gives some hope about the situation. In fact, we first called it Hope for the Holy Land. And then during our first filming trip, I got this idea that, hey, we're actually here. What people want to see is hope here in the Holy Land. So we changed it to Hope in the Holy Land. And hopefully when people see the film, they'll walk away with some of that for sure.
Yeah, I remember when he did it too. We were actually in our rooms. He was in his room, and it was the morning before we started filming. And he comes busting out of his room as if we were in a conversation already for like 10 or 15 minutes. And he goes, "It's hope in the Holy Land. We're in the Holy Land. It's in the Holy Land." And we kind of just looked at him and went, "Okay."
Mm-hmm. If I want to actually go back a little bit earlier than this point, and you both of your journeys as Christian Zionist writers, educators, how did you decide, and why did you decide to make a documentary about Israel and the Palestinians and this whole, conflict and history and religion? I mean, what got you to the point that you were like, we have to make a documentary about this?
So Elie Wiesel, Jewish philosopher, Holocaust survivor who passed away a few years ago, he wrote, "We must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented." And then he continues, "Wherever men and women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe." So both Todd and me had already been very engaged in educating Christians about Israel, about the Jewish context to the Christian faith, and we're certainly sensitive to the conflict and to Israel being under attack. And right after Tom or Todd made Tom, I know who you are.
No. Thanks, Jake.
No, you're but right before, actually, Todd released another film that he made back in 2012 called Promised Land, Israel Through the Eyes of Surfers. As you could see from Todd's shirt, he's a surfer, which was a great film that touched a bit on the conflict. It didn't, in my opinion, didn't go deep enough, because there were a couple of other films that were made that were all about addressing the conflict for a Christian audience that I particularly felt, and then Todd felt, was kind of, not kind of, but really unbalanced, not really fair in presenting Israel's side of the story. And that was influencing a lot of Christians to kind of sit back and question whether or not Israel had the right to exist, whether or not, when it was recreated back in 1948, as to whether or not that actually should have happened. And maybe the real story is that the creation of Israel was an injustice against the Palestinians. And so that really motivated us to consider making a new film, Hope in the Holy Land, that painted a more balanced, fair and balanced perspective on the conflict.
Todd, I would like to hear about your perspective.
Yeah, and then the other side of it, actually speaking to our own camp, those who consider themselves Christian Zionists, Christians who support Israel's right to exist in their own sovereign state, in a Jewish sovereign state. We wanted to challenge our own camp because both of us had dealt with things in our heart where we didn't have, I'll just say it this way, I don't feel like I had God's heart for the Palestinian people. And I knew that this had to change. And so the journey of discovery that the Hope in the Holy Land documents is a good deal of that journey of what is God's heart for the Palestinians. Because for me, it was always really easy to love the Jewish people. It's something that God gave me from a very young age. And I was missing the other side of the coin, though. and I'm still on that journey, and it's been amazing.
Yeah, there was someone at the church that I attended who challenged me. He said, Justin, if your theology doesn't lead you to love your neighbor and your enemy, then something's wrong with your theology. And I knew in that moment that I needed to do some soul searching just in my own heart about what were my feelings about the Palestinians. And I'll be honest, at that point in my journey, I was pretty indifferent towards the Palestinian plight and their experience. And so, Todd became the perfect partner to go on this journey with, and the perfect face really to it, since he had already made a fantastic film about Israel. And so the result became what we see now in this film, which I think really does kind of get to both sides and helps people to connect with people on the ground.
There are parts to me that kind of were interesting and I was learning, even though I was born in the region, I grew up in the region, I know a lot about the conflict, probably more than other people would probably know in the West in general. But for you, since we're talking about Christianity, as pro-Israel Christians, you were speaking to Christian Palestinians. And that was interesting to me, to finding those actual gaps and differences, even in the actual belief in itself. If you could share with us, for me, as somebody who saw the documentary, I really think it was educational in that way. Can you share with us your thought about those similarities and differences that you found with Christian Palestinians about the scripture?
Yeah, so I would say the big example of this would be with the Palestinian Christian liberation theology. And we have an example of that in the film. And you notice in the film that they just take any portion of the Bible, and especially the Old Testament is where you really notice it, but it's throughout both Testaments, Old and New. If anything seems like it's Zionist, or to put it in maybe a modern day term, like favorable to a Jewish national homeland and all those aspirations, they consider them Zionists, and they just do away with them. They don't even read them. They don't look at them. So entire swaths of scripture are just ignored. And then like one case which we document in the film is they do not consider the Exodus story, so Israel's Exodus story out of Egypt, to be a liberating story, because it was done at the expense of Egypt. So those are some major differences of how we approach scripture, how we view it, and how we interpret it with our lives.
Yeah, they generally they look at Christian Zionism as supporting Israel's right to exist at the expense of the Palestinians, and that would be a theology that we disagree with, and we would say that Israel's existence in that land, one, it would be a fulfillment of God's promises to the people of Israel, but two, there's plenty of space for both people to peacefully coexist. And that the Palestinian Christian community can play a very significant role in actually practicing hospitality and welcoming the Jewish people back to their ancestral homeland.
At one point, and I want to tell you this, as somebody who grew up in the region, I definitely felt the intensity of you guys being on the Palestinian side, talking to people, trying to understand their perspective. And there was one point when Todd was asking a question about the incitement of violence. And, I know this because I speak the language, I speak Arabic, and I understand the media, how the educational system works in these countries. And there is a lot of incitement of violence. There's a glorifying for people who commit actual terrorist attacks. I've seen this in my own eyes. So you've talked about that in your interview. And there was a moment that was really intense. And there was a lot of defensiveness, and you kind of were, trying to kind of explain your point of view. can you tell me about this moment, and how did you feel that you reacted to the complete denial of having this issue, this major problem, with the glorifying and incitement of violence?
Sure. So at that period of time when I interviewed, it was Sammy Awad. I was trying to test what I had learned. So this is what I had heard. I had heard that Palestinians are brought up to hate Israelis, hate Jewish people. And Sammy really pushed back, and he basically said, no. He said, I do trainings all the way from the north to the south in the West Bank, and I've never heard of what you're talking about. You got it wrong, basically. And so that launched me into doing man on the street interviews. So if this is what he says, I want to find out. So I'll go do my own interviews. And I did interviews from Hebron to Ramallah, actually even further north, into Nablus. And I found out just that, I mean, virtually every Palestinian I talked to said they hated Israelis, they hated Zionists, they hated Jews, and they affirmed everything that I was learning. So it was really interesting, because here you have, you have a narrative that says that Palestinians hate people, and then a Christian Palestinian says, no, that's not true. So what do I believe? Do I just take his word for it, or do I find out? And so I did my own research.
Several of the questions that Todd asked, I mean, very direct questions. Like, for example, do you believe that the Jews are trying to take over the world? Do you believe that the Holocaust happened? So some of the questions that we had Todd ask people were, for example, do you believe that the Jews are the ones who committed 9/11? Do you believe that the Holocaust happened? Do you believe that the Jews are trying to take over the world? And it was shocking. Everyone that we spoke to affirmed those questions, or in the case of the Holocaust, denied that the Holocaust occurred. Or some of them might say, well, if it was 6 million, that number was exaggerated. Or if it was 6 million, it was Jews killing Jews. But none of them believed that these things actually occurred. Or for, like the Jews taking over the world, they all said, I do think that that's probably what they're doing. Or 9/11, it was the Jews who did it. And we had heard that anti-Semitism was pretty prominent within Palestinian society. And, so to hear like Sammy deny that was the case, but then to go out there and to see for ourselves. Another example, we were in Ramallah, and in the heart of Ramallah, there was a guy selling used books right there, on Main Street. So imagine wherever you live, whatever Main Street is for you. And right there, he's selling Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler, which is considered to be the most dangerous book ever written in the history of the world. And, I was shocked. I couldn't believe it. And I think what bothered me the most about it is that there were several people walking by who easily could see the book, just like us. But there was no reaction from them like, oh my goodness, I can't believe that book is being sold in our town. To them, it was like any other book. And so seeing that kind of stuff, hearing that kind of stuff was shocking and startling, and also incredibly heartbreaking.
So you were there, Justin, when that moment happened, when Todd was asking the questions about the incitement, about the, hate and all of that and the violence, but then there was that defensiveness. How did you feel when you were in that, you've written a lot about anti-Semitism, you've published a lot of articles about this specific issue, and now you're there, you're seeing this face to face. How did that make you feel?
It was really heavy, to be honest. I felt like this is a completely different world than I'm used to. As an educator, it's you've heard stories or you've read, or you're talking about things or teaching about things that have happened in the past so that they don't happen now. And to experience that anti-Semitism is alive and well, that it did not die with Adolf Hitler, was actually frightening. And I'll tell you, at the end of that particular day, I was not feeling hope at all. I'm thinking this whole situation is hopeless. And yeah, so it was incredibly heavy, and I know it was heavy for Todd too.
And I actually want to tell you why this kind of struck me, because I grew up in the region. I know the level of the heaviness of the propaganda and anti-Semitism and the campaign of just glorifying violence. That when I saw the guy and how he was responding, it's almost you would think that he was so in denial that he believed that was not true, even though it's all around and you saw it personally when you were, walking down the street. And there were some times when you actually probably physically felt in danger. And I remember one part in the documentary when there was some shouting going on. And so tell me about this part. How did you feel being there, talking to people, and then having these incidents where some people did not want you to be there, and to be actually asking them and trying to have their perspective heard?
I was invited to spend a day with a Palestinian Muslim family in a refugee camp. And so I was just getting there and meeting the family, and they just served me coffee. They're telling some jokes and stuff, just kind of breaking the ice. And the shouting started happening outside. And it turns out that one of the neighbors didn't like it, that any other perspective besides his narrative was being shared. And our guide was simply saying, they've come to share both sides. They come to share this side of your side of the story. And they kicked us out. They said, get out. Basically, we got in the car and we left. It was pretty intense, actually.
Yeah, they were not happy that one, that we were sharing both sides. I mean, they said there's not two sides to this. There's our side, and they also I think just really in what our guide told us is they wanted to control the narrative. They didn't want other people coming in really onto their turf, because they wanted to be the ones who were the spokespeople for what was going on. And again, like I said, they were not sympathetic whatsoever to the fact that we would be sharing Israel's perspective.
So you also went to Israel and you spoke to many people there to victims of terrorist attacks that happened. And there was a lot of, heart-touching moments too. And just, the realization of how sad the realities have been. But also, I mean, there was a group called the Price Tag, that involved in attacking Palestinians in some cases. Can you tell us about this group and what you've learned, and how is the Israeli government responds to this type of behavior by some groups?
Yeah, so there's a fringe element within Israeli society, particularly those who live in the West Bank. They're known as Price Tag, and they sadly harass Palestinians, go into their towns and commit acts of violence, not usually against people, but against property. During our last filming trip, which was back in 2018, we were there in, I think it was July or August, and just a few months prior to that, in April, we had learned that there were 14 incidents of violence in one particular Palestinian village called Termis Aya is the name of the town. And graffiti, in, I believe, in Hebrew, that said like wreak havoc or wreak vengeance upon the nations and let us take care of them, of course, speaking of the Palestinians. And that kind of stuff occurs, not just in that town, but in other towns in the West Bank. And you can understand if you're a Palestinian and this is happening to you, why you're not going to have a lot of love for Israelis, for Jewish people living in the West Bank. And unfortunately, I mean, I don't know if Israel's doing enough to stop it. Oh, we asked a question to one of the residents in Shiloh, which is just a couple of miles away from this particular town. Is there anything that you think Israel can be doing, to better the situation? Anything Israel could be doing differently to better the situation with the Palestinians? I would have loved to have heard him say, yeah, actually, I think we need to shut down this price tag group and we need to throw them all into jail. But, he didn't bring that kind of stuff up at all. So I think Israel could be definitely doing a better job at prosecuting these people. But on the flip side, I'll say this: the majority of Israelis condemn that type of behavior. You can find reports in the papers of that kind of behavior being condemned. Whereas I have to say, on the flip side, it's a very rare occasion, if ever, when violence is committed against Israelis by Palestinians, that you'll find a condemnation by the leadership or really by anyone else within Palestinian society.
Yeah, it's actually the opposite. It's a reward system for violence. So, we know that they actually give money to people who commit terrorist attacks, which is very, not only evil, but destructive to the Palestinians themselves, to have this type of rhetoric. Because like you said, in Israel, there is different point of views, and everybody's expressing themselves, from the right, condemning of violence, as I believe is very, persistent on the Israeli side. That's why, like, for me, growing up in the region, I wanted to ask you, Todd, about this as well, that the education and how, people are being told, like, everybody is basically uniform in terms of how they see the world and how they see Israel. But for the Palestinians, there's always that question for me, because I saw many Jewish organizations, Israeli organizations, who actually work to help the Palestinians. They want to promote dialogue with the Palestinians. But on the Palestinian side, it seems to be a lot of just rejection, because it vilifies Israel as a whole. So when you spoke about, trying to challenge that perspective and maybe talk about the possibility of why don't you talk and try to find a solution with Israel rather than go somewhere else and try, to ask support from like Islamist regimes around the world, or, just to promote more violence. What was the response? Was that a part of the conversation?
With my Palestinian guide, we did ask him, what happens if you normalize with Israel, which means you become friends. You become friends with an Israeli or a group of Israelis or whatever, making normal relations. What happens? And it's heavy consequences. You can, lose your job, lose your livelihood, lose your life. And in that shame culture, which you know very well, I'm sure, your honor is everything. So there's very few people willing to stick out their neck and actually normalize Jews and Israelis and treat them like humans. And we actually noticed this with, it was a thread that we've seen throughout history, starting with the Hashemi al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, all the way in the 1920s, and his consistent rejection of any Jews living in the land. You fast forward to today, it's the same story. The story hasn't changed at all. It's a complete rejection of a Jewish state. It's the slogan is, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, which means there is no Israel. From the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, they will all be Palestine. And that's the chant. That's the slogan. So, it's really hard to have a peace partner as well when people don't actually recognize your right to exist.
There were one guy in a documentary with his face being hidden. He's a Palestinian, and he was really talking a lot of just, common sense things about dialogue, about peace, about the things that Israel provides, and that adds to the Palestinians, basically the opportunities to work, and the fact that it does not, the Palestinian Authority, obviously it's a dictatorship type of regime, does not give the Palestinians right. He had his face hidden. And he was saying a lot of things that I felt like, this would be a person that I would feel more hopeful to see more of, So why was he hiding his face? And he wasn't able to speak freely. I know I'm stating the obvious, but I wanted to hear your perspective being there. Yeah. And how did you feel also interviewing him, where you cannot have his face shown just because he is pro-dialogue, pro-peace? Yeah. Things that are actually good.
Yeah. He's hiding. We hid his face because his life is in danger from speaking out and not carrying along the party line, not carrying along the Palestinian narrative that you hear all over. You hear it in the media, and you hear it from the Palestinian Authority, and that's the narrative. And you don't sway outside that narrative, or else you be lights out. And then interviewing him, it was an absolute privilege. These guys are the Bonhoeffers of the Palestinian world, and in particular the Christian Palestinian world, much like Dietrich Bonhoeffer was in Germany when the Nazi Party was taking over and shutting down churches, and you could only have a pro-Nazi church. He went underground, and he stood up for the truth. He taught the Bible the way it was, from face value, and he upheld the Jews and loved the Jews, and he actually lost his life because of it. So we see these Palestinian Christians as heroes, and one of our big things for the film is to give them a voice, because up until now they haven't had much of a voice. You might get a couple articles here and there from them with one of their pen names, but on a large scale, you're hearing one side of the Palestinian narrative, and usually one side of the Christian Palestinian narrative, and that is an anti-Israel narrative. So it's refreshing, and it's very courageous.
So how did you feel when you were filming that part of this guy talking to you with his face hidden, and he's criticizing the Palestinian Authority?
I felt pretty good until he told me that Palestinian Authority government was in that building. So then I said, "Hey, I got to get a coffee," and I never came back. No, just kidding. Yeah. That's a reality he lives with, but that's not my reality. It's pretty uncomfortable.
Yeah, I felt like we need to get this footage out of the Palestinian Authority as quickly as possible, because if they, for some reason, get it, his life is in danger. And it's sad to think that that's the type of environment that they live in, that they're afraid to be able to speak out. I had a conversation, it wasn't during one of our filming trips, but back in 2014 with a Palestinian business owner, who I asked the question, what would happen if you spoke out against what at that particular time Hamas was doing in its conflict with Israel? And he said, I'd be finished. And I said, well, what do you mean by finished? He said, it's like bullet in the head finished. And I'm like, well, man, wow. How does it feel to live in a society where you can't, speak your mind? And he said, I just try to keep quiet and just kind of live and let live. And it's just incredibly sad to me that there are, I would say there's probably many Palestinians who are not at all happy with their leadership, but can't say so. And so hopefully our film gives a little bit more volume and platform for those Palestinian people.
To me, as somebody who grew up in the region, I know that how the system is of these regimes, these governments, is that they basically reward violence, reward hate, and then they will put a bullet in the person who is talking about otherwise, about peace, about dialogue, about, so it's really, when you look at those realities, it makes you feel a little bit less hopeful, let's say, about what could happen because this is a system. It's a whole system, from the media to the educational textbooks, to the things that are being published and thrown out on the streets for people to buy, like the book you saw with Adolf Hitler on the cover. So how does that make you feel? And I will go to other parts that are a little bit more hopeful, actually, from the documentary. But how did that make you feel, seeing these realities firsthand?
Those are the realities that make you feel hopeless. And that was my raw reaction on camera when I was asked that after one of these days. Some of those days were dark days in the West Bank. They weren't all dark, but in those instances, it felt very heavy and hopeless. And I actually felt like it was like a heaviness for them. It was a burden I felt, because they're actually trapped in it. They didn't necessarily sign up. They didn't sign up for it. They were born and raised in this society, which this is the norm. They don't even know, aside for the few that will do their very brave searching on their own and dare to question the party line. Aside from them, this is common knowledge. This is all you know. And I think that reflects when you, in our man on the street questions, where we ask the craziest conspiracy questions, and they believed them hook, line and sinker. Just shows that that's their world.
And it makes me frustrated. It makes me frustrated with the leadership of the Palestinians, because they're the ones who've led them really into this over the last several decades. It doesn't have to be this way. Things can change, but it's going to require a change of leadership and a change of vision in order for that to occur. But you look at Germany and other parts of Europe in the previous century. They didn't have much love for the Jewish people, and did some horrible things to the Jewish people. But yet, within a generation, things changed, perspectives changed, because of course they came to a realization of what they were doing, and I think new leadership in the Palestinian Authority could actually bring some hope. And then I think we see some things on the outside of the Holy Land. You look at the Abraham Accords this past year, and that is showing that there are Arabs in the region who are okay with Israel, who support Israel's existence. And those countries that did that, those are Sunni Muslims, as the majority of Palestinians are Sunni Muslims. So if there's other Muslims in the Middle East who can support Israel's right to exist, it gives me hope that there could be Palestinians who will do the same thing.
Yes, so this is definitely growing in the region, this rhetoric, which is very important, because the whole the theory of the Palestinians, the propaganda that was supported by many Arab governments and regimes, was the absolute denial of the ancient Jewish history in the land, which is not only in Israel, in Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, but it's also in so many other parts of the Middle East. So I think the acknowledgement and the understanding of the fact that this is the true history, but we just have to open it up. Let's learn about it because it's been hidden. And I wanted to ask your opinions as Christians, educators, believers, about that history, Judea and Samaria, for example, where there's the disputes on the territory right now. What are your beliefs about this? Because I believe this is a very important part where you had a part of the documentary when you went to this self-sustained kibbutz, and it was in an area that was empty, and that was where King David had lived, and he was a shepherd. And you showed how those people were working with Palestinians. They were self-sustained. It was a beautiful thing to see. That was hope for me. But at the same time, I mean, what do you believe about this, the history, the of the Jewish people in that part of the world that is basically denied? And then now there is the dispute about many of the, you know, different parts of this land.
Well, here's the thing. The Jewish people have an incredibly strong connection to Judea Samaria, which is referred to as the West Bank, which is the disputed territory, right? Where so much of the friction of this conflict occurs, especially from the perspective of the international community that talks about settlers, really Jews who are returning to this part of their historical homeland and saying really that they shouldn't be there because that's supposed to be the Palestinian state. But where do Jewish people come from? They come from Judea. That's where you get the name Jew from. And to deny their connection to it, to deny their desire to want to be there, is essentially saying, don't be Jewish. And at the same time, I also understand the emotional and historical connection that Arabs have to that territory. I mean, many of them, their ancestors been living there for 100 or 500 or maybe even 1,000 years. And so I sympathize with both people wanting to be in that territory. I just have a really, really hard time when anyone says that the Jews should not be there. That to me is essentially saying you shouldn't exist.
And let me add, the most beautiful thing that I saw while visiting the settlers was their relationships with the Palestinians around them, and their cooperation in business and in friendship. And so in Israel proper, there's not many Israelis that know Palestinians because of that barrier there, because of the security barrier. But when you get into the West Bank or the occupied territories, Judea, Samaria, you get settlers who, they speak Arabic, they have friends, and they live in a community that is both full of Jews and full of Palestinian Arabs. And it's not the story that you hear in the media. The story you hear in the media is the price tagger story, and the settlers causing a bunch of trouble. But like Justin was saying earlier, that is a fringe movement, and for the most part, I didn't meet any settlers who were okay with that. They were all okay with living amongst Palestinians, and they demonstrated that with their life. They actually walked it out, and I got to see that, and that was that's where the hope rose in me. It's kind of funny to say, but Jews in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, the Palestinian territories, their existence there is that sign of hope, because that's where the dialogue is happening.
And it's also hopeful when you hear a Palestinian who unfortunately wouldn't say it on film, but he said, I'd be totally fine if Israel annexed the West Bank. I think we would have more rights, more freedom under Israeli sovereignty than we currently have under the PA. And you already have, look at 20% of Israel's population is Arab, and the vast majority of them are fine with living under Jewish sovereignty and having an Israeli flag with a Jewish star waving. And so if that's the case there in Israel proper, then I think you can expect that the same thing could happen even in the Palestinian territories.
And I go back to my knowledge and my experience being from the region, because I just grew up seeing the level of abuse of Palestinians by so many different Arab states. You guys were telling me before we recorded this that you were going to actually go to Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, for example. Well, I've heard from people firsthand accounts from the people who are there about the level of desperation of the Palestinians in these places where until today they live in the most horrible conditions. They have no hope for the future, no job opportunity, no education. can you imagine that there's no education, for example, in the Palestinian camps in Lebanon, and they've been there for decades? There is a lot of, it's very sad, but there is that level of basically abuse of the Palestinians and a use of the Palestinians to just hate on Israel, to attack Israel, and to blame the Jewish people. While at the same time, the Palestinians in Israel, they're actually getting a lot better treatment, so many more opportunities, good, like just equal opportunities. So it is a major gap. And I don't think a lot of people understand these realities of the region. And then we see the Palestinian Authority as well abusing the Palestinians. So the BDS movement, and this is something that you guys touched on and was really impactful too to watch, is how the people were working in Israeli manufacturers and different, they had job opportunities, and they were really just kind of happy because they're making so much more money, and the treatment and everything. And it was just very interesting to see, that in a documentary in English, because it's important for people who are trying to do the BDS, how the Palestinians were saying, please stop the BDS movement. That's going to hurt us.
Yeah, it is quite ridiculous when you go visit one of these Israeli owned and operated industries in the occupied territories, and you meet the people, you find out 70 to 80% of the workforce is Palestinians working alongside Israelis, and they work like family, and they make 5 times more than they would in a Palestinian-run factory. And if to boycott and divest and sanction that factory because it's Israeli owned and operating in the West Bank, if you were to do that, you're only going to hurt the Palestinians. The Jewish owners are going to have to move somewhere else. It's major inconvenience. It's going to be sad. It's also going to be sad because you're breaking up a family, but you're really hurting the Palestinians who live there. So what is BDS all about? Is it pro-Palestinian? I don't think so, because if it was, it wouldn't be advocating for something like this. I think they hate Israel so much, they're willing to also harm their own people in doing so. And that goes across the board. This is not unique to BDS. What you were describing in Syria and in the refugee camps in Lebanon, they are willing to treat the Palestinians so bad, and they're brothers. I mean, it's the same blood. They're willing to treat them so badly, so that they can then point the finger at Israel and say, look what you did in 1948, which is also a very screwed up narrative. And meanwhile, the Palestinians are living in squalor and nobody's helping them. Yet very few people know the truth of what's going on.
That's right, they don't. Nobody reports on those Palestinians, because why? Because those are Arabs treating other Arabs poorly. But as soon as a Jewish person is perceived as treating a Palestinian poorly, then it's frontline news. So it's a double standard, and it's hypocrisy. And sadly, there are real people who are suffering as a result of this. And that's hopefully one of the things that people will get out of our film, is that these are real people. And, I grew up being taught everyone matters to God. Doesn't matter, how you were born. You matter to God. And if you matter to God, then you should matter to us. And I really hope that as a result of this film, people will have much greater compassion for both Jews and Arabs, for both Israelis and Palestinians, and bring the right remedies to the situation. And separating people is not the way to do it.
Why did you not go to Gaza to film some parts of the documentary? I know I am asking an obvious question here, but I just wanted to hear if you guys have tried and you couldn't. Yeah. We know that a terrorist organization named Hamas controls Gaza. These people in Gaza are suffering because of this terrorist organization. But were you trying to go there and you weren't able to? I mean, we know of the treatment of the Christian Palestinians there because it's an Islamist organization.
It's actually early on, it was a part of script to go into Gaza. The reality of that happening became it wasn't going to happen. And so what we did was we filmed it on the outside region of Gaza, and we were going to do a segment on it. Was going to be a part of the film, and it was amazing. We got some great footage, heard some amazing stories, but because the film is long, there's so much content, we had to cut something, and we didn't include Gaza because we had so much in the West Bank, and they overlap in a sense. And then what we began to realize that the viewers already do not know that the West Bank is not connected to the Gaza Strip. And so we wanted to simplify things for people, and you can't include everything. So it's not that it's not important. And actually Gaza is way more radical than the West Bank. But we couldn't include it all.
Yeah, because if you ask the Christian Palestinians if they would be able to be in Gaza, they probably say no, because we saw videos of the abuse of the Christian Palestinians in Gaza.
Yeah,
right
it's
now.
harder to be a Christian in Gaza than it is in the West Bank, and it's already hard for Christians in the West Bank. So yeah, radical or fundamentalist Islam is definitely more of a problem within the Gaza Strip. But we do touch on it in the film, radical Islam. So in fact, more than touch on it, we cover it pretty thoroughly. And so that element, that ideology, if anybody wants to know what's going on with Gaza, just turn up the fire a little bit, and you know what's happening there.
Just looking at the Palestinians and the identities of the Palestinians, there is a conflict of identity between, what the Palestinian Authority is, which is an Arab identity, and then there is the Gaza Hamas identity, which is an Islamist identity. Neither of these identities are Palestinian. So they're competing with each other, but they are the dominant ones. And it's always that question comes up about the identity, of the Palestinians. Is it Arab? Is it Muslim? Because they seem to be the dominant identities, except when it comes to Israel. Then there's a Palestinian identity pops up. So it's kind of interesting to see this.
Well, we definitely heard that there is considerable tension between Fatah, which rules the Palestinian Authority, and then Hamas. They do not like each other whatsoever. There's definitely tension there. I think a lot of Palestinians are just struggling with who they are, and really, I think it's frustration with their leadership, but they're definitely not all on the same page. I think it's unfair to view the Palestinians as speaking with one unified voice. They do not, and we need to be able to listen to the different perspectives that are within Palestinian society.
And Todd, also, this is when you were talking to Arab Israelis. So there was the part about the Arab Israelis and how they were just a part of the Israeli society, and they were enjoying, being in a country that provides these rights, that you guys went surfing all together, a group of mixed. I mean, I'm sorry, am I giving up the documentary here?
That's
but
it.
it's really should I be taking this out?
No, that's okay.
But that was really beautiful, and I just wanted to ask you about your impression also about that part, because they're Arab Israelis, right? That's the way they identify themselves. But how did you feel about that? How Israel is basically a country that has different minorities: the Druze, the Arab Muslims, the Christians, the Baha'is, you name it. Obviously with the Jewish people living together in harmony.
Yeah, it's something that, again, you don't hear in the media very much, and getting to know some of the Arab Israelis and just asking them some of those same questions of would you rather live here or Palestinian territories, or even in some other part of the Arab world? And one of the guys said that he lives, it's a paradise. Those were his words. It's a paradise here. We have more rights here than anyone else in the Arab world, and we love it. And we're citizens of Israel. And of course, you don't get that from everyone. That's not that, there are those who don't agree, but that's pretty remarkable if you think about it. Israel could have, they fought a war with Arabs in 1948. They very easily could have said, you know what, this is too risky to keep any Arabs in this state because they're a fifth column. They could turn on us at any moment, and yet they didn't. And now there's about 2 million of them. So those are again the hopeful stories that you hear, and it was amazing to meet some of those guys.
What do you think, Justin?
Yeah, I echo what Todd is saying. I think it's important for people to understand that Israel has a lot of Arabs who live there, who like living there. If given the choice, would choose to live there than anywhere else. Again, go back to, would you want to be an Arab living in a Palestinian refugee camp in Lebanon? Or would you want to be an Arab living in the state of Israel? I guarantee if you were to ask 10 Arabs that question, probably all 10 would say, I choose Israel. And this is the story that needs to be told. This is the truth. And why people want to continue to demonize Israel and call it an apartheid state. You got to question your own heart, your own motives, and what information have you really been listening to? Maybe it's time to start considering some other perspectives and actually listen to the people on the ground.
Wonderful. Lastly, I just want to ask you about your perspective on the developments in terms of the Abrahamic peace accords that we're seeing happening right now, and how so many Arab countries are realizing that Israel is actually, it's for the region's look that Israel is there. We have a Silicon Valley, there's all these innovations in terms of water, agriculture, so many things that the region needs, and it's right there. And we're seeing now that the peace is growing. People are talking for the first time. To me, it's miraculous as someone who grew up in the region. But how do you see this? And are we going to see you do maybe a part 2 about the whole region and how things are developing?
Well, Javi, if you have some friends who'd like to fund that film, we'd be more than happy to consider it. You look at how some things are changing, and it gives you hope. Look at Israel's existence is a benefit to the entire region. If you were to take Israel off the map right now, the economy of many parts of the Middle East would suffer. And so again, if you really care, if you have a heart for Arabs in the Middle East, then you're going to have a heart for Israel. You're going to have a heart to see Israel thrive. Not only are the Arabs benefiting who live in Israel, but even the Palestinians. Think about it, 20,000 Palestinians a day cross over into Israel to work. And as Caleb Myers in our film says, that puts like food on the table for about 1 million Arabs a day. So if you really care about Arabs, if you care about Palestinians, then you're going to support Israel's existence in that part of the world.
Yeah, and I would say that the Abraham Accords are absolutely historic. It does feel like a miracle after all these years of the Arab rejection of Jews living in the land. Finally, there's these governments in their world that are fed up with it, and they want to normalize relations with their relationship with Israel, and they want to benefit from their economy and from their technology and agriculture. And and it's mutual as well. I mean, Israelis want to travel there, and it's really nice to see. And I think when people, in fact, I know when people begin to talk, when those delegates begin to talk, and then the people and the Israelis begin to travel to and from these countries, and there's a mutual relationship going on, things are going to loosen up. They're going to realize that they're people, they're not enemies. And I hope that steamrolls, and I hope that puts a positive pressure on the Palestinians to do the same. Because we know, we can just look at history, that the Arab rejection of Israel and Jews living in the land has not worked. It hasn't been good. It has a terrible track record. Let's do something new.
Well, I will end it on this very hopeful note. And thank you so much, both. I definitely encourage everyone who's watching us now to watch the beautiful documentary Hope in the Holy Land. It's very, it makes you think. It brings up some unknown things for the person to learn about the conflict and what's going on in the Holy Land. And thank you so much, both. And I would love to have you on again in the future.
Thank you, Havy. It'd be great. Thanks.
Great being with you.
Thank you all for listening and watching with you, The Untold with Havy Buzo. I will see you next time.